Hey, this is Sam, and welcome to another episode of the Mcat Master Interview Series. This is where I interview top Mcat scorers and extract their highest leverage Mcat study strategies, the key insights, the inspirational moments, and so much more from their Mcat journey. All so that you can get the most reliable advice on how to increase your own Mcat score very quickly. So today I'm interviewing Tim Knavel. Tim, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So Tim is a non-traditional student, and his story is definitely not what you'd expect from the typical pre-med. He went from dropping out of a community college with an incredibly low GPA to getting a 513 MCAT score and going to a top university. And get this, he went from a 500, which was his lowest practice MCAT exam score, to a 513 on the real MCAT in just 4 weeks. So I have a feeling this is going to be one of our most inspiring interviews, and I hope that you're just as excited as I am. So to start off, Tim, please tell our listeners a little bit about yourself so we can get to know you a little before diving into all the MCAT stuff.
Sure. So I am a senior at UC San Diego. I'm studying biochemistry here in the chemistry and biochemistry department. And currently outside of school, which, and the related extracurriculars, so volunteering at a hospital, and I'm actually in the process of trying to get another internship right now. Also, I actively record music. Friends of mine, we're just about to get something down for that. And I am a very passionate learner as well. So I read all sorts of books and about everything from medicine to psychology to art, all kinds of stuff. So try to keep it eclectic.
Nice, that's awesome. When you practice music, do you have like a YouTube channel or anything like that we can check out, or like kind of getting there? Or
Well, we're not there yet.
yeah.
Once we have some recordings done and all that, we will blast the world with it. So
And I look forward to that. And that's great. It's always nice to have like a creative hobby on the side just to kind of keep you sane.
yeah, it's important. I think that in life, if you have success in one area, it tends to inform success in other areas. So I see
Yeah,
it as a study tool as much as reading textbooks, actually.
exactly. I love that. And that's something we actually talk about a lot, is like have those fun activities that stimulate your mind in the fun way. And that will in turn complement your studying and everywhere that you need to be logical.
Absolutely.
Nice. So what was kind of like your story? What inspired you on this path towards becoming a doctor and practicing medicine?
Sure. So as you said in the intro, so I graduated high school
Mm-hmm.
and I had no interest in going to college or anything.
Mm-hmm.
I went to community college anyway. I didn't have the grades to go anywhere, to go to a four-year institution. So I went to community college. I
Mm-hmm.
did. Now, most people say terrible, but it really wasn't that bad. My first stint in community college, I got 1B and everything else was either an F or a withdrawal. So when I say
Wow.
I did bad, right?
Wow. Yeah.
So I dropped out. I took some time away. I was playing in a band. I was working. And in that time, I was also dealing with personal issues. And
Mm-hmm.
in general, I was just a very, very dysfunctional person dealing with substance issues and that sort of thing. And
Mm-hmm.
so in the process of sort of getting my life together and all that, I kind of realized, the stuff is kind of interesting, not just on a logical level, but on a human level too. It's this process of healing, irrespective of whether you're talking about, mental health issues or, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I just found it kind of fascinating, and it kind of planted a seed in my head as just it's something that I found interesting. And I slowly started to read. My interest started with mental health. So I started to read about different sort of mental health conditions and the treatments that went along with that. And then it expanded into things like diabetes and cancer and Parkinson's, and it just kind of snowballed. And at some point I realized, this doesn't just have to be something that I think is cool to read about when I
Mm-hmm.
have time. Like, maybe this is something I can actually pursue. And I didn't even know what that meant, but I felt like it was something that I needed to be a part of. And then I slowly figured out, okay, well, hey, I could go back to school, slowly, take the courses that I need to, and then maybe eventually, end up somewhere near medicine. And
Yeah.
so after 3.5 years of putzing around and not doing a whole lot, I went back to school and spent 3.5 years at community college and took all my prerequisite courses there. I ended up working there. I still work there as a tutor and in the, it's called supplemental instruction department. Some of the
Hmm.
listeners might have that as a student help resource at their school.
Yeah.
And now I'm at UCSD. So crazy how it all
Yeah.
changes. But
Wow.
it wasn't really one specific thing, I would say. It was kind of a snowball of different pieces fitting together.
And when I think about your story, I think of how, everything that happened turned out to be like a blessing almost in disguise that led you here.
Absolutely. I see it as an asset, and it's very difficult when you're in the midst of pre-med stuff and got to take this class and got to study for this and
Yeah.
you get so locked up in doing the same things that everybody else has to do, right? Everybody has to take general chemistry. Everybody has to take physics.
Hmm.
Everybody has to do the Mcat. Everybody has to da 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 da.
Yeah.
And obviously those things are important, but when you apply to medical school,
Hmm.
and you have the same things on your application, the same stories, the same, oh, I did this, the same, I did that.
Yeah.
You look like everybody else, and
Wow.
that's not to say you go out of your way to live some crazy life or whatever, but it
Yeah.
means that see those different things as an asset. Those things stand out
Hmm.
because remember, they're not just looking for science robots that get
Yeah.
4.0s and do nothing but study. They're looking for human beings to take care of other human beings. And those
Exactly.
other things are just as important as, doing well in organic chemistry or whatever.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that. They want you to bring your true self to the platform. It's almost like a lot of people in their applications, in their interviews, they try to be who they're not. Instead, I like to think of it as be who you are, do something interesting, just embrace everything about you and bring that forward. And everybody in their own unique way has an inspiring story. But yeah, that's great
Absolutely.
advice.
Yeah, absolutely. And maximizing that too, owning it, because that's when you put on your application a
Hmm.
unique person, and you are that person in your interview, and you are that person in medical school, and you are that, like that. Remember that this is not just about being a medical student. The whole
Hmm.
point of this is to be a person that can take care of other people, and there's a lot to that beyond just knowing everything in a biochemistry textbook or the
Wow.
like.
Yeah. Wow. Really well said. So, if you could describe the MCAT in one word, what would that be and why?
The word that I would pick would be thorough. And the reason I would say thorough, well, I mean, there's the obvious one in terms of it's very thorough test of content that that
Hmm.
everything from your undergraduate, basic science education is up for grabs. It's on the table, electrochemistry, everything. But the other aspect of the thorough is it has nothing to do with content. I would say the even more thorough aspect of the exam is it's testing how you manage yourself. So the first way in which it does that is how can you prepare for something, right? Obviously, there's studying for the Mcat exam. How do you
Yeah.
do that? How do you conduct yourself when there's a lot of pressure to perform on a very long and difficult exam? How do you do that? And
Hmm.
then how do you actually perform in the exam? That's another aspect of the thorough. How can you manage yourself under stress,
Hmm.
under fear, under confusion, under feelings of being bombarded with, information and questions and all this stuff? So
Hmm.
that is just as important as knowing the content. And so that's why I would say it's thorough. It's thorough in terms of the content, but also in terms of testing your self-management.
Yeah. Yeah. Completely agree. And a lot of that self-management aspect goes overlooked. And I appreciate that. And it's obvious why you did well that when you are bringing emphasis to that aspect to students. And I think you're right on. Like that makes complete sense.
And I've seen it in my peers. I had some friends that were studying for the MCAT at the same time I did.
Hmm.
Some of them even took it in the same room that I did. And it was something I kind of had to harp on them. Like, remember, guys, this is, there's a lot that goes into this test that has nothing to do with content.
Hmm.
And it would be like only studying a quarter of the material in an exam and expecting to
Yeah.
do well or hoping to do well. It's like
Exactly.
you look at self-management as it's testing that. That is content on the exam, just like oxidation reactions, just like
Hmm.
kinematics, just like psychology. And it's as much part of the test as anything else.
So, question for you, like self-management is also a skill that needs to be kind of developed. What were your ways of going about developing that skill? Because it's also like, it's like, okay, I'm going to take the MCAT. Now, all of a sudden, I have to not only learn all this information, but also I have to learn how to develop the proper mindset or like the proper ways to learn and all that kind of stuff. So, how did you go about that?
Sure. Well, the first step to me is just observing yourself, observing how stress affects you, observing how being nervous affects you,
Mm-hmm.
how being overwhelmed affects you. You got to figure out that part before you can do anything. And some people sort of know very, very well, know intuitively, when I'm
Yeah.
stressed, this happens or what have you. And that's awesome. But even if you don't, it's something that through, some self-observation, you
Right.
can pick up on. And then from that, before you do anything, you've got to say, okay, or you got to have some self-compassion about, okay, these are my tendencies and I
Mm-hmm.
understand that, and I'm going to do my best to work with them. Let's say when you get stressed, you're a crier,
Mm-hmm.
okay, now as you build sort of your plan, understand that there might be some moments, and
Mm-hmm.
that's okay. I know it doesn't feel
Right.
like it, but that is absolutely okay. So having that self-compassion and understanding is very important. Then you can go about building that into how you study. Like, so for me, for example, my big thing is when I get stressed, I guess the best way to describe it is I just get really, really physically exhausted, and not just, mentally, like, oh, I don't feel like I start falling asleep at my desk and that
Mm.
sort of thing. It just wipes me out physically.
Yeah.
So I had to incorporate that into my study plan. Well, first of all, obviously, I have to make sure that I'm getting enough rest, which for me was about 7 hours, 8 if I was super, super lucky. That was an ideal amount of sleep for me. But
Mm-hmm.
then also, if I'm studying and I'm feeling stressed and I'm starting to get a little drowsy,
Mm-hmm.
close the book, go for a walk, go for a jog. I have a gym that's, maybe 10 minutes from my house. I would
Yeah.
go down there and work out for an hour and come back. It's difficult to do things like that because
Mm-hmm.
when you're stressed, anything that's not studying seems like a waste of time,
Exactly.
but it's
Yeah.
not. But it's not. The
Yeah.
thing about stress is, okay, like imagine if you had somebody in your life that always told you the same thing no matter what, always told you you were great, or always told you you were never good enough or something like that. You would kind of take their response to things with a grain of salt, right? Because it's like
Mm-hmm.
they say you're good or they say you're not so good. You don't really necessarily know if that's right. Well, stress is exactly the same way. Stress will never tell you that you're
Mm.
doing great. It will never tell you that what you're doing is good enough. And so I'm not saying ignore stress, but be aware of the fact that sometimes you have to go out of your way to force yourself to do things that your stress might be telling you is not the right thing to do, but it is the right thing to do.
Mm.
Sometimes you need to go and walk, or sometimes you need to go and work out, or have a snack, or go play with your dog, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
That stuff
Yeah.
is so, so, so important. And that kind of approach is with self-management as far as studying goes. Now, the exam, I mean, that's a whole different can of worms, I would say.
Mm.
And that's developed through, just mostly taking practice tests, I would say, learning
Right.
how to stay calm and breathe and remember that not only do you know the information, but what you need
Yeah.
to answer the question is it's right in front of you. It's not buried in your general chemistry textbook somewhere. You got it. You have it.
Nice. Wow. Yeah. So that's huge. Even for me, like and I honestly, I consider myself like this. I read a lot of like self-development books, a lot of psychology books, and even listening to you talk, I'm like, this is a huge reminder to me as well. Like, have I ever consciously been aware of my physical response to what happens to me when I'm stressed? Like, I know about like these concepts of taking a break, when I feel overwhelmed, but what is my physical response to stress? I haven't really thought about it. I don't know. So that's something that I'm taking away from here as well. Like just developing that awareness about what happens and working with that, using it as a part of the process, not an obstacle in the process.
Right. The other problem, too, is if you in your mind frame feeling stressed or feeling overwhelmed or feeling sad as like a failure,
Yeah.
then you're guaranteeing that you're going to feel like a failure. That the reality is that is a part of the process. It's kind of a good thing because what that means is you're doing it. You're putting in the work. You're pushing yourself. And sometimes you got to just take a breath. Another thing I would like to mention as far as that goes is, mindfulness is all the rage nowadays, but it really
Yeah.
is. And it's very difficult to overstate the power that mindfulness has in terms of tuning into that, and it doesn't have to be,
Right.
lighting candles and humming Buddhist chants and whatever. It
Yeah.
just, sitting and being quiet. Notice, how does my body feel? How am I breathing? Am I breathing in my chest? Am I breathing from my stomach? Sometimes 5 minutes is enough to sort of taking an inventory of yourself. Where are you at?
Yeah.
What do you have going on?
Yeah. Love it. And I completely agree. Mindfulness has been huge, and cultivating just trying to be in the more in the moment kind of thing it's always very helpful. Okay, I do want to move
Yeah,
on.
absolutely.
So again, you might have talked a lot about this already, but where were you before you began prepping for the MCAT? What was going on in your life at that time?
Sure. So I took the Mcat this past August 31st,
Mm-hmm.
2019, if you're listening to this at a
Mm-hmm.
later time. So at UC San Diego, we have a quarter system. So the spring quarter, it runs until mid-June. And the winter quarter, which is the term before that, it starts January 4th. You have a
Mm-hmm.
spring break, and then you go straight into your spring quarter. And so I started studying during spring quarter. So during spring quarter, I was taking a pretty hefty load of classes. I had a physical chemistry, quantum mechanics class. I had a very intense biochemistry class. I was taking a class on drug synthesis and design. So I was pretty busy. I was working 2 jobs and trying to get some music stuff going as well. So that's kind of where I was at, trying to figure out how in the heck I'm going to fit MCAT studying in, you know.
Yeah. And so how did you like end up scheduling your MCAT prep into a full busy life? A lot of our students, they have that exact same issue where so much is going on. A lot of them have full-time jobs. Some of the non-traditional students have children to take care of. So how did
Mhm.
you manage to schedule your prep amongst all this kind of chaos?
Sure. So the first thing I did is I took an inventory of what I'm doing already. So I'm a pretty organized person. I schedule literally every minute that I'm awake. If I'm driving from this place to that place, it's in my schedule. If I'm eating, it's in my schedule.
Wow.
And so that is, you don't have to necessarily go that hardcore, but if you don't have an inventory of all the things you're doing already and how they fit into your day, it's going to be very
Hmm.
difficult to fit more things. And so that was kind of the first thing was, okay, well, what am I doing already? And
Mm.
where are the gaps in terms of time? Where can I use my time to fit this stuff in?
Yeah.
And as far as during that spring quarter, I accepted, hey, I'm going to be pretty limited. And
Hmm.
that's okay because I can approach this such that I maximize that time and I don't have to study for, at least right now, I don't have to study for, 6 hours a day or 7 hours a day or whatever. So for me, it was, an hour or 2 at a time during the
Hmm.
day. And I kind of built that. And once my quarter ended, then I had more time. I was still working, but I had a little bit more flexibility. And so then I sort of restructured my schedule just around my work now, knowing that I didn't have any classes. And then I was able to sort of build in more time. The one thing I will say though is just because you're studying for 8 hours a day does not mean you're really studying well. If you have a good plan and a good approach to what you need to do and you understand what you need to do, you
Hmm.
don't have to study for 8 hours. Now, if you want to and you get benefit out of it, then I mean, by all means, as long as
Yeah.
you're taking care of yourself and as long as you're doing those other things we talked about, do that. But that really was, for me, it was more about making sure that the time that I do spend is as efficient as possible rather than just, I'm going to study for, 160 hours this week or whatever.
Right. And how much time did you in total devote to the MCAT?
It's a little bit of a tricky question. So like I said, I took it at the very end of August. I started
Right.
studying at the beginning of May. And
Hmm.
from May until about June 30th, I was studying. And I was so burnt out from my winter quarter going straight
Yeah.
into my spring quarter and then my MCAT
Hmm.
studying picking up before spring quarter even ended. I was so
Hmm.
burnt out. I was so useless. I was getting questions wrong that I would never ever get wrong. And so I decided, you know what? I need to take a few days of just nothing, no studying. I spent those days trying to relax. That wasn't enough. So it turned into a week.
Yeah.
That week wasn't enough. So that turned into 2 weeks. And so I ended up actually taking 3 weeks, about 3 weeks off from like mid to end June into July. And I know that sounds like, why in the heck would you do that?
Yeah.
But it had to be done. I was not being productive. And I
Yeah.
recognize that. And continuing at that point is only going to make things worse. So overall, in
Yeah.
terms of actual studying,
Yeah.
I would say about a month and a half to 2 months.
Yeah. That makes sense. It just is a reflection of your level of awareness that what we were talking about before. It's just like, you know what, if it's not the right time to study and if I need time for myself, I need to step away, then I'm going to do that. I'm going to prioritize that over as much as my mind might be telling me like you need to study. What are you doing? Like the test is like really close. But I think that, and like clearly it paid off. So I think smart move, and like I applaud your level of just self-awareness.
Well, thank you. Yeah. And I mean, it's something that, I mean, if people could get anything from
Hmm.
listening to this, it would be, the issue there is fear, really, being
Yeah.
horrified of. You told me at the beginning of my studying that, hey, you're going to
Hmm.
take 3 weeks off, roughly a month and a half out from the exam. I would
Yeah.
be to say, you're crazy. Why do that? But it's what had to happen. And so, I mean, I'm
Right.
glad that I did. At the time, I was, very scared and freaked out over the whole thing, but it was what I needed to do. And sometimes
Yeah.
that's what needs to happen. So listen to yourself.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. And So when you started studying, did you have a score goal in mind? And if you did, how did you come up with that?
Sure. So my target score was a 520, and I picked that understanding that it's okay if I don't hit that score, but I'm going to study as if I have to get a 520.
Right.
And I don't know where I picked that. I don't know why that was the number. It just, I don't know if it just sounded good or what, but that's what I picked.
Cool. And you've only taken the Mcat once, obviously.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I'm trying to get like a visual of your prep entire process. So about a month and a half to 2 months. When did you study content? Did you have a phase of content studying and then kind of like practice exams, or did you interweave your practice exams throughout? Like, so how did you structure that whole thing?
Sure. So it was kind of a sort of a binary process. So before I did any studying, I took a practice exam as sort of a diagnostic just to see where I was, and like a full length one. I know some companies offer sort of half length diagnostic ones. I wanted to just take a full one, full length, regular time, just to see how that went. And based upon that, I would use that to sort of say, okay, well, based on what I got wrong and why I got it wrong, this is the content that I need to review. So I have organic chemistry down. I remember nothing about embryology. I'm really bad with this. I'm really, whatever, making notes of that and then studying that content.
Yeah.
And then taking a practice test again. Basically, the idea being let the practice test guide you in what you need to review, because otherwise, what are you just going to, you can't just,
Exactly.
unless you're going to take a year and a half to prep, you can't just study everything cold. So that was kind of my thing, was going back and forth. And then once I got to the point where, you know what, this is not a content thing anymore, then that's when I just hammered practice tests. Because at that point, it's like, okay, now this is about strategy. This is about learning how to read questions properly, learning how to think about these questions better, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, makes complete sense. And so you probably already hit on these points a little bit, but if you had to talk about your biggest challenges, your biggest struggles and roadblocks that you experienced throughout the MCAT journey, what were those and how did you overcome them? And again, if you've mentioned some of them, just let me know.
Sure. I would say that just unbelievable level of burnout, that was probably the biggest challenge. And as far as dealing with it, like I said, I needed breaks. I needed time away from studying. I needed to just be a human being, remind myself that I'm not just an MCAT robot.
Yeah.
I'm a person and I need to tend to myself.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so here's the highlight, right? You went from a 500 to 513 in just 4 weeks, which a lot of people would be like, that's mind blowing. Like, that's really quick because the 500, 490, high 490s mark is where, from our experience, we see a lot of students just plateauing and not being able to figure out how to just get their score to increase from that point on. So, how did you do that? And if somebody wanted to increase their score like you did, what advice would you have for them? What were your most effective strategies, methods that you used?
Sure. So in my opinion, that jump had almost nothing to do with content. That's a big thing I would say. Almost all of it was strategy and learning how to read questions better. So the first thing that I did, one of the strategies, and I forget if it's in the essentials, in the MCAT Mastery Strategy Guide, the download, or if it was in one of the emails or what. But what I started doing was I started reading the questions as if I was a person who was writing the exam and I was checking it. Right. So like imagine myself. So I'm a person and I'm writing these MCAT questions that could go into an exam. I need to check them over and sort of look through them and see, are these good questions? Are there holes? Are there whatever? And that was sort of a big thing for me, is thinking about it from the perspective of the person that's writing this. What do they want me to think? What do they want me to get tripped up on? What are they trying to distract me with? And as a result, I started seeing how much of a passage was useless, or how much of a passage was a distraction. And I wouldn't say it was like an overnight thing, but definitely after I read that, the next practice test, I was like, oh, there's some things there. And then the next one, it was more. And then the next one, it was more. And it just kind of snowballed. That was a really big one. The other one I would say is I kept a really good track of why I was getting things wrong and why I was getting things right. So I made an Excel document, and every time I took a practice test, I went through each section and I looked at each question that I got wrong first, and I categorized why I got it wrong. And I had 4 categories. One of them was content. So I got it wrong because I didn't know the information that it was asking. Another one had to do with, I made like a silly error in terms of I didn't read the passage well, or I made an error in calculation or something like that. The third one was, it was just a really, really hard question. It was a really strange question, or the passage was really difficult to understand. And then the fourth one was the category I called duh. So this was something that like, I know it really well. It was I just had a momentary lapse of reason. And what that did was it started helping me realize, a lot more about what I was getting wrong. So for one thing, I noticed that a lot of things I'm getting wrong are because I'm making silly mistakes. And the reason I'm making a silly mistake was because I was freaking myself out. I was so terrified of getting questions wrong that I
Hmm.
wasn't really paying attention on how to get them right, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
So that was huge. And then, and this is another thing I got from the MCAT mastery material, was
Hmm.
why did you get things right?
Yeah.
That's super, super big. Well, what about this? What was it about this passage that illuminated this question to you? What was it
Hmm.
about this wording? Was it one word that gave it away? Was it a process of elimination? What was it? So I would say that those three things were the biggest keys to me jumping on my score.
Yeah, yeah, and all of those are great and they make complete sense, especially hinting at one of your first points where you were talking about how you need to get in the like see why the question writers or like the passage writers have written what they've written. And that goes back to being able to put yourself in the shoes of another person. And a lot of times that is the essence of what AAMC is kind of testing you on. And are you doctor material? Are you able to put yourself in another person's shoes? Because that's like such a strong characteristic of a great physician.
Absolutely. And the thing too, that one thing that I noticed was in tandem to that, you're
Mm.
exactly right, was I realized, hey, in all these classes that I've taken, I'm so used to the problems and the information and the questions being
Hmm.
clear, right? All the unknown variables are very clear. All the known variables are very clear. But
Right.
when you're talking to a patient, it's not going to be
Exactly.
like that. And so you got to be able to be asked a very convoluted question or be presented with
Yeah.
very conflicting or strange information
Hmm.
and make something out of that. So it's,
100%.
yeah.
Yeah, that's huge. Wow. So you hinted at this a little bit, I think, but what materials and resources did you use during your MCAT prep? And do you have any recommendations? Do you have any of those where you're like, don't touch those ones kind of thing?
Yeah, as far as review books go, I bought the Princeton Review, that like 7 book set, and that was very helpful. I used the practice tests from them
Yeah.
as well. I did some AAMC ones as well, or I did one of them. So those books were very helpful for me to review the content. The one thing I will say about that, and this is probably
Hmm.
true in general, is a lot of those books go very, very, very in depth. They give you everything that you could ever possibly maybe sort of need to know on a topic. That can be very dangerous. And you make sure that you go surface level first, and if you need to, dive in. So just as just a general warning about review books, I would say that that's something to pay attention to.
Yeah, that makes sense.
As far as MCAT mastery material goes, my main source was probably the Top Score MCAT Strategy Guide. That
Mm.
was huge. And there were a lot of things that I got out of that. You're kind of hearing me talk about the MCAT and sort of I have like a sort of a, I don't want to say philosophical approach to it, but
Yeah.
it's kind of like
Yeah.
that. And that resource really helped me with that. It really
Mm.
helped me think about the exam in a different way and what the exam means and how to approach it. That was huge. I would say that is, obviously you need review books, but if you had to get one other MCAT, piece of help material, that would be the one that I would say you would have to get. Another thing that I used was the MCAT Mastery, the must-know MCAT concepts. That was very helpful too, because that helped me sort of plug in some of the holes. So, and I will say that that list is very good in terms of everything on that list is probably, I would say, the most high yield content. That's the stuff that it seems like shows up the most frequently and is the
Hmm.
stuff that you need to have sort of the best grasp on, I would say. I would say that's the information that has the widest utility on the
Yeah.
exams. So that was really very helpful for me as well. I would say that those three materials, the Princeton Review books, the Top Score Guide, and then the must-know concepts, those were probably my three big resources, and I
Mm.
can't recommend them enough.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you for the kind words. There are actually a lot of the resources that we create, they're from experiential kind of sources. So like literally from so many interviews like this and research on exactly the way top scorers just think about the MCAT and that kind of thing. And a lot of that just ended up being things that you're talking about, like having the self-management skills and seeing the exam for what it really is. And these are the things that I feel like a lot of, I guess, the bigger kind of prep companies, they overlook. So they give a lot of the content information, a little bit of the strategy, but they miss such a big chunk. And that was what our intention was in putting out everything that we've tried to put out in through our emails and whether that's through our resources. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Oh, that was the other thing, the email list. I
Mm.
can't believe I forgot that. There are 1,000 great strategies in the email list. That was super helpful too. And I liked it, especially because it was like little nuggets, these
Hmm.
sort of frequent small nuggets. Sometimes you get this humongous strategy and it can be very difficult to even know like where to start with it. And
Yeah.
those emails were really helpful too, because they were these like kind of bite-sized pieces that went a long way.
Yeah, I'm glad that those helped you as well. Yeah, those are our little ways of giving a daily dose kind of to students when they're going through MCAT prep and just giving them, whether that be a dose of like motivation or like just strategy on like a little tip here, a success story or whatever it is, just to push them forward in getting through this with like the most efficiency. So I want to dive into like the different sections of the MCAT. So I'm looking at your scorecard and
Mhm.
you scored a 90% in biochem. And any tips that you had from that would be awesome to know. How'd you study for it? And do you have any advice for students who are struggling with that section of the MCAT?
Sure. So I think for me, my perception of that section is it's the section for which the passages are the most misleading. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of biochem passages where they are super long,
Mm-hmm.
very detailed, and only 3 sentences of that passage actually really matters that much. And
Right.
that's very challenging to sort of sift through. And it's very difficult to sort of describe, I guess, an approach to it. But having that in mind, and this actually goes along with what we were saying before about sort of getting in the mind of the question writers. That approach is probably helped me the most on that section. I think because of because of the way the passages are, it's difficult to sort of even know what is important in this. And that strategy alone, I think, really, really boosted my score. So apply that strategy to that
Mm-hmm.
section. The other thing I would say too about that is you have to remember that they can only cover so much. And I know, yeah, there's questions on that, but they are not going to ask you about everything. And I know that's kind of like a daunting task. It's like, how do I know what
Yeah.
to cover? I think that, and again, this goes back to like the must-know content, that document that you guys have, but also the practice tests are a pretty good guide, I would say, as far as the content that you need to do a deep dive on. There are certain things that they will probably never, ever ask you about, and so it makes no sense to memorize the chapter on that stuff in your review book. So use that must-know concept list in general, but then also use your practice test as a guide for, oh, hey, there's a lot of questions that deal with this topic. There's a lot of questions that cover this. Oh, I haven't
Right.
been asked a single question on this, that sort of thing. That was huge for me, I would say.
Nice. Yeah. And do you feel like biochem was inherently like one of your strong subjects? And because a lot of times, like the subject that you feel is strongest for you doesn't necessarily mean that you score the highest in it, or in the same way for the section that you struggled with most. So what was your strongest inherently kind of subject, would you say?
I definitely feel that most comfortable with chemistry. I'm majoring in it. I've been tutoring it for 4 years now. That's definitely the area that I feel the most confident in. I feel pretty comfortable with it too. I mean, I've tutored that for a while as well.
Yeah.
But if I was going to pick which section I got the highest score on, I wouldn't have picked biochem.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's always interesting to know. So for ChemPhys, so then you scored a 128 in there, which is still awesome. How did you study for that? Do you have any tips or strategies for that section?
I think that the biggest thing that made a difference there was physics. So like I said, I'm very comfortable with chemistry. That really wasn't an issue. In my physics courses, I mean, I did well. I got
Mm-hmm.
A's in all three of them, but I had a difficult time developing my physics intuition. I think I kind of used equations and math as like a crutch.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the MCAT, I mean, the calculations, if there are calculations, they're not
Yeah.
super crazy. And so for me, I would say it probably applies to chemistry too, but especially for physics, definitely need to know equations, but it's more important that you conceptually understand how things are related than you memorize every equation in your physics textbooks.
Yeah, that's great to know. So moving on to another section. So cars, that was looks like it was your weakest area with a 127. Still a good score, but did you have any advice for students who are struggling with cars? What happened? What would you have done differently?
Well, I would say, and this isn't just specific to cars, it's kind of in general, but that's
Mhm.
especially true for cars. I think, as I outlined before, sort of the timeline to my taking the MCAT, I think I just needed
Yeah.
more time.
Mm.
Cars was the most stagnant on practice tests, and then and obviously here, the lowest car score I ever got was a 126, and the highest I ever
Wow.
got was a 127. So
Yeah.
it was the most stagnant, and I think
Yeah.
I just needed more time to digest how to approach it. Unfortunately,
Hmm.
and I have no idea how this happened, but I must have
Hmm.
been living under a rock or something. I didn't discover the car strategy that you guys have until
Yeah.
about 2 days before the exam.
Oh no.
Yeah. So again, I have no idea how that happened, but I would definitely utilize that. As I know people that have used it, their car section was actually their best score. So I think that for me, that was that. As far as advice goes, I mean, obviously that's not something you can prepare for in terms of content. It's all about strategy. So anything and everything you can find on car strategy, do it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and to be honest, like I was kind of surprised as I'm looking at your score now after speaking with you that cars was your lowest because something doesn't add up here. Like you're an avid reader, you're putting your very well good at putting yourself in the perspective of the question writer, which is exactly one of the biggest strategies when it comes to cars. Then there's like the critical thinking aspect of it. Like it seems like you had it down, I guess, and that makes sense that you're already doing well in it, like with a 126 even like without any kind of work on it. So it makes sense. There was a disconnect, but like, okay, I get it. You just needed more time.
Yeah, and it's not the end of the world. What are you gonna do?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, got it. That's great to know. And anything noteworthy, or do you have any tips at all for psych soc?
Yeah, so I actually think that's the most unique section. And
Mm,
the reason for that is that earlier we discussed sort of the things the exam tests outside of content. And I think that stuff
mm,
really comes into play on the psych
mm,
soc. So it's called psych soc, but
yeah.
really what it should be called is psych soc, experimental design, statistics, and self management. That's really to me that, and I've talked to a lot of people and heard and read that sometimes people, that's their weakest section, even though there's a lot of people that think of it as the easiest, and usually they think of it as the easiest because they think of the content as being. But what I would say is, consider this: it is the last section on the exam. What
Mm,
that means is you've spent several hours taking an exam on very difficult content in other areas, and now you
yeah.
have to rally at the very end. That alone is very difficult. It's so easy to just start thinking about, where you're going to go to
Yeah.
eat afterwards, or I don't
Yeah,
really
exactly.
care about, it's whatever. That is a big part of that section. I sort of think of it as, imagine if you are 11 and a half hours or 12 and a half hours into a 14-hour overnight hospital shift, right? And
Right.
you're exhausted and you're tired and you just want to phone it in and you're whatever.
Yeah.
You have to be able to work that last hour and a half as if it was your
Mhm.
first. And I think that's a big part of what they're testing is, can you hang in there? Can you stay
Yeah.
focused? Can you stay efficient?
Yeah, no, that completely makes sense. A lot of people kind of even dismiss it to their own detriment in the sense that it's going to be easy. So they kind of maybe take it a little bit easy, but it's something that you need to maintain your focus on for sure.
And what a shame it would be to tank an otherwise good score by not doing well on the quote unquote easiest section.
Right, right.
Even if that's correct, which I don't necessarily think it is, if those are the
Yeah,
easy points, quote unquote, in the exam, you want to gobble those up.
exactly. And how horrible would it be if you're just below like a 510 or something like that? And like you could have gone those few points and kind of been more competitive in your application.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just have a few more questions. Maybe I'll even cut it down. I want to be respectful of your time. So it's MCAT day. Can you just walk us through what that day was like? How did you prepare the night before, the day of, what was going on through your mind? Just anything about MCAT day itself.
Sure. Well, first of all, the day before,
Hmm.
I was lucky to get a testing date at a center that was very close to my house. So I
Right.
drove over there the day before just so I knew. Now I know that I can get there. I know where
Yeah.
it is. I know where the office is and all that. So that was big. The night before, the whole day before, I made sure that I ate nice, healthy food. I tried to sort of relax. I went to the gym. I played some guitar, some mindfulness, and everything was sort of about preparing for this. In my mind, it was kind of like and this might not work for everybody, but I'm kind of thinking of it as you're going into a fight, and
Yeah.
the day before your fight, you don't want to burn yourself out and go into it exhausted. Do what you have to
Exactly.
do to prepare yourself for the battle that's coming.
Hmm.
Yeah, you asked about the day. So the
Yeah.
day, I woke up and I drove over there. I made sure to get there nice and early. So I got there about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour beforehand. With me, I brought some snacks. So I brought some almonds, I brought some
Nice.
fruit, some bananas, and a bunch of water. And by the way, my last couple practice exams, I did complete dress rehearsal. So during my 30-minute break after cars, I
Yeah.
had my almonds and my banana and my water. And so I
Nice.
basically tried to rehearse everything. So yeah, so I brought the same food that I had been rehearsing with, got there nice and early. I said one of my friends was taking the test in the same place as me. So
Yeah.
he got there early too. And we just kind of chatted and just tried to breathe and relax. And then once we walk in there, it's go time. You know,
Nice. Nice. And near your score goal before the few practice exams beforehand, just out of curiosity.
the highest practice that I got was a 510.
Mm.
That's something I'm still figuring out. And those were Princeton review tests.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
I know
makes
that
sense.
the word kind of circulates that they're pretty challenging. I would
Exactly.
agree with that. Those were definitely more difficult than I felt they were more difficult than the actual exam. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So what happened on the day that you got your score back? Like, what was your reaction? What were you expecting? Just tell us about that.
Sure. I was at school, and so they got released. When they got released, I was at work. And so my friend told me that they had been released, and I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to check while I'm at work. Just, if it goes well, that would be great. But if not, I don't want to have a meltdown in front of a bunch of students or whatever,
Yeah.
So after I left, I went to school, and I sat down, and I was like, all right, well, let's just check it out. And I was thinking going into it, I was like, if I get a 510, I mean, I can probably, we'll see. The one thing I was terrified of was like a 507 or a 508 because
Right.
that's like, is that
Yeah.
okay or not, And I opened it up and saw 513. It took like a day and a half for it to really sink in, I would say. At first,
Yeah.
my first immediate reaction was not to jump up and down. I was kind of like, oh, interesting. And then it just kind of slowly seeped in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes complete
Yeah.
sense. And so, yeah, we're almost done. And like, anything at all did you have to say to somebody who's listening to this, who's just kind of burnt out with their MCAT prep? I know you've given a lot of insights already, but anything last minute that you have left unsaid?
Sure. Well, two things. Number one has to do with fear. I would say that one of the biggest aspects of doing well is managing your fear, managing your fear of not doing well, managing your fear of not even just respective to the test. What if I don't get into medical school? What if I did
Yeah.
that? All these things start coming up. Some of them don't have anything to do with the test necessarily. And that goes back to that self-awareness and that self-assessment that we were talking about before. It is so, 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 so important, particularly if you are prone to being anxious or being fearful or being, having that kind of experience. Being afraid is part of it. You're doing something that is very, very, very difficult to do. You're going to be afraid. You're going to be worried. You're going to be scared. That's not a symptom of something being wrong, nor is feeling burned out, by the way. That's part of the deal. In tandem to that, the other thing I would say is, as we said before, part of what they're testing you on is how you handle feeling overwhelmed, how you handle being confused, how you handle being stressed, bombarded, all these different things. That's part of the exam. So do not, in your head, characterize those feelings as something wrong. Oh, I have this question. I don't understand what it means right off the bat. Something's wrong. No, that's not what it means. That's not what it means. You're supposed to be there. You're supposed to be there. The difference between top scorers and not is I never was confused or I was never overwhelmed. It's not that. It's how do you handle that? How do you push through that? Yeah, so that's the other thing. I actually did a last thing, as if I haven't been long-winded enough, is specifically, as you mentioned, I'm sort of a non-traditional student. We touched on this before. Be you. And obviously that's, some like stereotypical hippy-dippy advice. Just be yourself, man. But it really is an invaluable asset. If you look the same on an application, if you getting a 4.0 in, molecular biophysiochemistry or, the craziest sounding major you could come up with is awesome.
Yeah.
But they're looking for humans. They're looking for humans to take care of other humans. And if you have a unique aspect of your story, if you're a non-traditional student, left school, came back, got a degree in nothing to do with medicine or science, and are coming back, and, you cannot overstate how valuable that is. So cherish those things and own it. Just because you don't have a biochem degree or just because you don't have this or that, it's like, that's okay.
So lastly, I just wanted to know what your plans are for just the short and long-term future. Where do you see yourself? It's always inspiring to know what your vision is. And I know you said you have a lot of goals, whether it's with your music or the medicine. If you could just provide any kind of vision for yourself, that would be really good to hear.
Sure. So in terms of the shorter term, it is fall quarter right now. I have one more quarter before I graduate, so I'll graduate after winter, and I'll be done then.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to take a gap year, and during that time, I have a job lined up. I have an internship lined up. I'm going to do some shadowing as well. During that time, I will be obviously applying to schools. In terms of the medicine stuff, that's sort of my short-term goal. As I said before, trying to get this album recorded and all that, so that's a huge goal for me as well. But long term, obviously medicine is, I'm hoping, going to be a big part of my life, but continuing to make music is super important. Traveling for me is super important. Teaching is really, really important. So as I said before, I have 2 different jobs doing various forms of tutoring type student support. If I could teach in some way, whether that would be at a medical school or at a community college or somewhere, that's something that's super, super important to me as well. In a nutshell, those are kind of my goals. I don't know if I said it right, but traveling a lot is super, super important to me.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. And truly, just thank you for even being here and just sharing all your wonderful wisdom. I enjoyed it a lot. It's great hearing you speak, and you are really good at teaching. So, and I can see where that's coming from. So thank you. This was fun. Good luck with all that you have coming up. And from Mcat Mastery, wish you all the best on your journey.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to share what I have to say. So I really appreciate that.
Hey, this is Sam again, and before you go, I just wanted to say thanks for listening. We have links to all the different resources Tim mentioned and a complete transcript of this interview in the description section, or you can simply visit mcatmastery.net/interviews to get them. Lastly, since Tim clearly shares so many of our values, is a great teacher, actually struggled with figuring out how to increase his score to a competitive level, and did it at such an incredible speed with such smart strategy that we had to bring him on to the Mcat Mastery team as a tutor for our students. His track record has been great so far, so if you're interested in working personally with Tim on figuring out what's holding your score back or what you're not doing that can increase your score quickly, or if you need help with specific sections that Tim excelled in like bio or chem phys, then feel free to sign up for Mcat Mastery tutoring and request Tim to be your tutor. You can learn more about that on our website at mcatmastery.net. Again, thank you, stay positive, give yourself a break if you need it, and remember, you got this.